Welcome to Insights as a Service, the podcast that helps MSPs get ahead. And today we are doing that by talking about pricing, how to get a clear and really science-driven approach to your pricing, which has never been more important than it is now, in my view, with inflation tracking the way it is. I've talked about this in an earlier episode where I talked about our pricing review at Lightwire, but the man who helped me understand what I needed to do and stepped us through that process was Ron Wood from a company called Pricing Insight. And today we're going to talk to him. He's going to tell us about the sorts of considerations that go into constructing a really clear and well thought out pricing strategy. With all that said, let's get underway with Ron Wood. All right, Ron, welcome. Thanks for joining us. Let's just kick off with a general intro. I know who you are. I've worked with you before, but why don't you tell everyone else who you are, what you do?
Oh, thanks, Brennan. Okay, everyone, my name is Ron Wood. I'm the founder and managing director of a business called Pricing Insight, and now recently another business called Pricing University. I started my career in pricing back in 1997, so it's a little while now, nearly 24 years in pricing, and working with a range of different companies from FMCG through to B2B industrials and retailers. And then Pricing Insight started in around 2007 and worked with maybe about 115 companies since then.
What was why pricing? Like what were you doing that made you realize there just wasn't enough of a focus on pricing and that there was an opportunity in the market there for you?
I think I distinctly remember there was a pivotal defining moment. We were in a meeting. I was working with a company called Arnott's, and we used to have these meetings at 7 a.m. in the morning. Um, the sales director liked to get up early and he'd ride his bike for an hour and then come into the office. And of course, everyone
No
suddenly
pressure,
learned
but everyone be like me.
pretty much, yeah. Suddenly, everyone learned to enjoy early mornings really quickly. But there was a moment where we were having a discussion around pricing of a very tasty biscuit called a Tim Tam, which is one of the most popular biscuits in Australia. And Coles, which is one of the big Australian supermarket chains, had put a special on Tim Tam. It said save 50 cents a packet or something. And Woolworths was about to run a promotion on Tim Tam the week later, and Woolworths took umbrage at Arnott's for allowing the competitor to run a special the week before their special. And so Woolworths deducted off remittance 50 cents a packet as a punishment for upstaging, if you like, the Woolworths promotion.
Right.
And it was worth about $300,000 in pure profit. So, most companies, their profit margins around 10% on EBIT or earnings before interest and tax. So that was worth $3 million in sales. And that item in the agenda for that morning got skipped over in about 25 minutes. It was like, oh, gee, that's a problem. How did this happen? What's the damage? How do we avoid it? Okay, let's move on to the next item. And I remember thinking, coming from a small business family, that kind of money is eye-watering amounts of money. And I was about 26 at the time. And I remember thinking, wow, there's not a lot of skill going on here as far as obviously managing the clashes of promotions and price disciplines, and B, focusing on that as a discipline in itself. And in that time, pricing was typically run by salespeople. They had full 100% jurisdiction over it. And that set me on the road to studying prices and discounts. And then I eventually one day walked into the managing director of the business and I said, if we keep doing all these discounting the way we're going, we're on an autopilot with all these discounts and we're going to land the plane 10 feet below the Earth's surface if we continue the trajectory we're going. And that got his attention. And then I did some more number crunching, and then I came back with a whole series of recommendations around avoiding discounts and setting price points. And then he turned to me and said, would you like to do this job full time? And I kind of said, yeah, this is pretty interesting. I'd been up till 10 o'clock midnight for the last week crunching numbers. Back in 1997, software and computers weren't as powerful as they are now. I think you probably had more powerful mobile phones than you did laptops back then. So um, it it was a bit of a labour of love, and you've got to imagine that you're not sure what you're looking for. There's no template, there's no textbook, there's no internet to try and look up how to do X or Y. There's no YouTube channel that someone will show you. So I think it was a lot of just digging around the dark. But I presented this information to that, and he said, "If you'd like to do this full time, just tell me what you need." So I came back a week later and said, "I need a team of 5," and then that was the start of the pricing career.
Right. And I think from there, you've gone on and created a really sort of um, a great framework that's really turned into more of a science. I think just the the aim here, of course, is always to help managed service providers, in the IT space, and I guess any telcos listening as well get ahead. But particularly for MSPs, there's less and less levers they can pull to, I guess, drive their profits. So they've got a lot of subscriptions that they sell, a lot of Microsoft licenses, which have a retail price that there's not a lot of movement on. There's not a lot of ways in which they can price that differently. And there's very limited margins because they have a buy price and a recommended sell price. But then they've usually got a per seat cost as well. They've got a cost where each user that they support within the companies that they work with, they have a per head cost. That's usually how it works. And there is such a range in the market, $30, $120, massive disparity. And it's the same across Australia and New Zealand, at least in my experience. So what I'm really interested today to get from you is some insight as to how people can really use a framework like yours to put some you know correlation between the value that they're providing and the price that matches that. So I guess to start off with, what pricing mistakes do you most commonly see? I mean, when we're dealing with sort of businesses here, probably less than 100 staff. So in that space, what are the things that are mistakes that you keep coming across?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think the most common mistake that is made by people charged with setting prices is referring to their costs as the first port of call to determine a sell price. So, in other words, they'll look at their costs and then they'll determine a margin percentage or a per unit margin, and then they'll simply add that on top of the notional costs that they've determined, and then that becomes the sell price. That you would almost have to say, as a universal rule of pricing mistakes, using costs as your proxy for value is probably the biggest mistake anyone could possibly make.
And I think you call that cost plus, right? That's just cost plus pricing.
Yeah, it would be typically known as cost plus pricing or markup pricing, something of that nature. Around the world, there's different terms for it, but um, the real issue is
So, and
people.
what's the problem with that? What's
Well, the challenge with cost plus pricing is that um, a customer's perceptions of value is not always correlated with our, when I say our as a supplier, our cost position. So, and our competitors often may not have the same cost position as us. So, um, thinking that everyone has exactly the same cost position is probably a fundamental error in assumptions. So you're already behind the eight ball there. And then your profit expectations is another fundamental flaw in assumptions, because your profit model, your business model, may require you to have different ways of making profit. So if you think about mobile phones when they first were launched, the phone was a expensive purchased item, and then the phone companies quickly worked out, well, let's just give the phones away effectively or put them on financial plans. Um, they've moved away from giving them away to monetizing them and actually making a profit out of them, but over a 2-year term, if you like, and then upselling insurances, etc. But essentially, the revenue model and the charge model for, particularly in use the telco space, for example, is quite different. Um, And if you're trying to make, say, 40 or 50 points of gross margin on everything you sell, you'll end up selling nothing because you don't even get access to the customer to start with. So that's the first piece of the puzzle, is that the way you run your revenue model needs to be aligned with how customers can buy from you easily. You can't afford to have a salesman there for every customer helping them buy a phone, if you like. They've just got to decide it's a great phone and they're going to buy it, and then you do the rest. So that's the first fundamental issue. The second one that's probably less well understood, but is actually the most critical, that is that customers are value-seeking animals. They don't necessarily seek the lowest price. What they're looking for is the best value. And that's a really important statement. So I'll just say that again, that customers are not looking for the lowest price. They're looking for the best value. And if we
Yeah,
unpack
it's
that a
huge. That
little.
was a real revelation for me as well. But sorry, carry on.
Yeah, no, sorry. I like to do this game with workshop teams. I say, imagine if Aldi was in charge of everything, or Costco. Pick any budget, anything, and think about like a diamond engagement ring, and your partner to be says, "Yeah, where did you buy this engagement ring?" And he said, "I got it from Aldi." Maybe that's going to be a very short engagement.
Yeah, not quite the messaging.
No, that's right. Or you take a bottle of red wine around to your friend's house. It's her or his birthday, and you've been asked to dinner, and you take a bottle of red wine, and you make a point of saying, "I didn't pay any more than $5 for this bottle of red wine," and everyone in that table is going to think, "Well, gee, I'm glad I didn't realize you thought so much of me." um, so there's the concept of everyone seeking the lowest price can be contradicted in a multiplicity of different purchase environments. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with the reality that humans, when they search for solutions to their problems, want the best solution to their problem. And sometimes they understand the short-term solution, which might be what you'd call the quick fix, low-cost quick fix. Let's use IKEA furniture as an example. It's cheap and cheerful, although not so much these days. They've traded themselves up, but let's use IKEA. It's a cheap and cheerful quick fix, but everyone who's ever shared a house knows that within 2 years or a year, that bookcase has got a sagging shelf and it probably needs to be replaced. But it only cost you $200. The longer term solution would have been to pay $500 or $700 and got a more sturdy bookshelf. So one of the challenges that we have with this concept of helping people buy value is educating them on value. And that's really where the frontier now is in anything we do in our price setting, we've got to educate customers on value before we ask them to transact with us.
Yeah, it's great point. It really comes down to that, I guess, business persona, the messaging, the public facing comms. And we'll come back to that. I just want to touch on, I guess, a related point, which is, and as we were saying before we jumped online, inflation is very much a thing at the moment. It's something you've been talking about for a long time. Anyone who follows you on LinkedIn will know that you've been very focused and accurate with your comms around this well before it really got into the public domain, as a consequence, I guess, of essentially quantitative easing, money printing, and logistics pressures, etc. What does that mean for pricing strategies? And I suppose, as a follow up question, um, how much of a light does that really shine on that cost plus pricing issue?
Yeah, it's a good question. So you're right. The signs for inflation were very evident even in the early stages of 2020. Once the monetary policies, the fiscal monetary policies started to kick in, which is effectively quantitative easing, as they like to call it, which is in simple terms for everyone else, it's just money printing. They don't technically print more physical notes. Physical notes represent only 4% of any currency in circulation, in inverted commas, but they buy bonds. You'll hear other terms like they've bought bonds. The Federal Reserve has bought bonds, for example, as it's basically injecting money into the money supply. Now, there's some interesting charts people can Google. If they're listening to this, you can Google M1 money supply, Federal Reserve. And anything to do with M1 or M2 or M3 money supply, there's multiplicities of different definitions of money supplies, but M1 or M2 will be fine. And you'll see that the monetary printing was tracking along at a fairly steady, consistent rate for a number of years. And then come 2020 and 2021, it rockets up almost at a 90-degree angle, 6 times the normal volumes. So now you have 600% more money floating around. And so many companies said, oh, we've had our best year during the pandemic, et cetera, et cetera. And it's not necessarily because of changes in demand. It's because there's so much money floating around. And the other element to this, not just the quantitative easing piece, was the fact that interest rates kept being reduced and then put on hold for such a long period of time. And the central banks consistently signaling that they weren't going to change those interest rates. So here in Australia, we've got official interest rates at 0.1%, so a tenth of a percent. And you've got retail interest rates for banks and mortgages at 2.5%, sometimes 3% for 5 years fixed, for example. So they're still fairly benign low interest rates. And what did that do? That sent property prices upwards on a trajectory of 50% price increases we've seen over the last 12 months, almost across the board, give or take a few exceptions here or there, some up 50, 80%, some up 25 and 30, but on average, almost every suburb has increased. So the impacts of inflation are being felt in some of our most immediate, literally in our own backyards. For the impact of inflation, not just on property, but on everything else, you'll see that commodity prices, if anyone would like to Google, prices of aluminium or prices of nickel, or gold even, you'll see them all rocketing up, plus 50, 70, 80, 100%. Lumber, timber's gone up. All of these core ingredients that go into building houses, for example, the inputs have all rapidly increased. So what does that mean? Well, steel and aluminium all go into products we use, household items we use every day. Oil has also increased, which is a petroleum product which is used for plastics, etc. So we all know about how they end up in the household. So ultimately, consumers are paying substantially more now for what they were paying. And these changes to commodities are not just short term. The supply chain freezes and logistics you mentioned earlier look to be able to be worked through probably within 6 to 12 months. There's backlogs out. I've got records of clients saying that there are building material backlogs, 6 months delay. So the supply chain thing is not just a 2-month, 3-month thing. It's going to go on technically it's a structural thing. It's going on for a long time. But in terms of implications for pricing, if you're setting prices and you're listening to this podcast and you typically hear price points like $9.95, like I've got retail clients that set prices at $9.95, $19.95. In the internet space, it could be like $99.95, for example, as classic psychological price points. All of those price points are going to be absolutely made redundant now over this cycle where $129 is going to become the new normal, for example. People who are determined, if you like, to hold on to the $9.95 or the $99 psychological pivot points will almost inevitably be forced to downgrade the quality or reduce the offer of whatever they're doing to match that price point. So, and that's what people are doing, is if they're trying to keep that price point, they'll reduce the value of the offer. The majority of businesses that I'm seeing and I'm working with are raising price points. There's an interesting conversation around how you raise price points, of course, but that's essentially what's going on, is that we're seeing price points increasing across the board in almost every single category, whether it's a product or a service.
So, a few points off the back of that for me. One is that if you're in a business and you've taken a value-based approach to pricing, which potentially means that at the coming off a high value a product that compares well in terms of the value provided against the market, then you've probably got a higher price point. You've got a couple of choices then. Probably one is diminished margins as costs increase, and probably a lesser difference between your price point and the competitors as they up theirs to match. The other one would be, of course, putting your price point up and hoping that your comparative value remains. The other one, I suppose, is as you said, you can always choose to not adjust your price points, but drop the input costs. I'm a big believer, though, in the difference between good profits and bad profits. I think that you need to focus on the customer experience, and off the back of that, you will drive greater value and therefore greater profits. I think that if you try and stick to some price point that you've arbitrarily decided is the price point, and off the back of that, try and do things like outsourcing, moving things offshore, whatever it might be, that at the back of that, the customer experience will diminish, and you'll short to medium term probably hold your profitability, but I think longer term probably not. I don't know if you agree with those sentiments, but feel free to jump in.
Look, Brendan, no, you're spot on. I think all of us in business want to be disciples of value. I always believe that the days of bad businesses being run for short-term profits. Hopefully, we're entering a new phase of consciousness where people do things not just for it's great that people do things for the environmental concerns, that triple bottom line type concept. We serve our customers, our shareholders, and the environment. All of those three elements, there's a price that must be paid. If we want products to have let's take a plastic product that has a recyclable life cycle so that it gets reused. Again, there's a cost in taking that plastic away and repairing it, and that needs to be built into the sell price that the customer pays up front. So it's absolutely vital that when you look at value pricing, that you look at those things. If you take a triple bottom line approach, which I think is definitely the right way to go, you shouldn't be pricing for value, but then allowing your margins to be supported because you have an unethical waste dumping policy, for example. That's not value pricing at all. So, and if you're creating a product where the customer buys it and then they're confused about how to use it, or they don't get the support they need, or they're waiting on, the classic would be in the internet where you might buy cheap internet's provided service and you have to wait 3 hours to get, a call back, or you're hanging online. You wouldn't want that. You'd want to be served quickly. So if customers understand that value, going back to our original point, once customers understand value, then as value disciples, we can set those prices with confidence, with ethics, and with the knowledge that we're doing the right thing by all the stakeholders in the mix. Probably the twist that I'm seeing with it all is that different competitors have different business models. So I've got clients now where one of them is in the business of selling, certain outdoor gear, and their competitor is effectively got a McDonald's style business model where they're actually in the real estate business. So they're busy discounting products and so forth to move volume. And so the other business that's actually in the business of creating value and selling products because they love selling great quality products is being caught a little bit flat-footed by this competitor kind of undermining the market a little bit. So customers are confused. They're saying, well, hang on, you've got a product over here that's from the competitor that's $99 and you're trying to charge me $149. I'm not sure if I should pay that 50% premium. So the challenge is that sometimes in our business of price setting, what we need to do is look at how we transition a price increase to market that's safe and efficacious, but also brings our customers along with it. And sometimes customers need to feel price certainty. So in some cases, instead of necessarily offering discounts, we might hold price points. So there's ways and means to increase prices, if you like, rather than necessarily raising prices. And in the retail space,
So they're an example, I guess, for MSPs that are listening. If they give a price break based on a volume model, 10 to 20 seats is $50, and then it goes down from there. Getting rid of those kind of breaks is one of the examples there, I assume.
Yeah, spot on, Brendan. Just changing those particular ways customers can access value. So you might, if a customer's going to access a price break, they might have to buy more quantity or something. If there's a manufacturing or a throughput efficiency there, I mean, that whilst that references cost, of course, if you're in the market trying to be, you've got to keep a weather eye on your competition and main competition. What you want to do is to look at your portfolio of services that you offer. And what we typically find is that you, at the top 10, 20% of all products, it's heavily contested. We're talking about mature markets here, and we're talking about products or services that there are other competitors in place. If you've got a unique market and you've got a unique product, a totally different conversation can be had, as you'd imagine. But if we assume for probably 80, 90% of maybe people listening or people who are discussing prices, usually there's the pain points that they have is that they've got a competitor who's undercutting them. They've got customers that are not used to paying price X or Y, and they've got to take, in the face of that, they've got to take a price up. So typically, what we advise clients to do is to take a portfolio approach to their product or service offer, and then figure out which ones allow them to maintain their positioning and which ones are signaling value. And you can take the prices up on the things that deliver ultimate value. And maybe you migrate the more price competitive things up at a slightly slower run rate. But all the same, you're not going to be necessarily planning to down margin the product. But I bring up the reducing the service offer because there is a massive trend. It's called unbundling. So people don't want to have a full service offer. They want to have the core offer and then add on to it, almost like choose your own adventure, choose your own value menu. And that's a fabulous way for companies to maintain competition, but also find opportunities to create value and also get paid for that value as customers start to atomize up and split into those that want basic services and those that want full service provisions.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think just thinking back to that MSP scenario where some MSPs will be offering $30 a head, some will be charging 120. Um, it's the positioning, isn't it? It's making sure that you're doing enough to educate the market to your value, so that they don't perceive those two price points as offering the same value. What are you doing that that $30 offer isn't if you're charging 120? Or for that matter, if you're giving the $30 option, how do you make people comfortable that that isn't perhaps it is with less value, but how do you then understand who that appeals to and really target in on that particular sort of company demo? That was a big learning for me through the process I went through with you, is just understanding who do you want to sell to, because before if you don't know that, you cannot possibly get your messaging right.
But no, spot on. And I think the thing that struck me when we were talking, about the Lightwire solution was that it has enormous value for a very specific style of customer. It delivers a fantastic job. So once you understand who that customer is, you can build your revenue and business model around making sure that customer's problems and need states are solved, and all those great things that you do with the redundancies and things built in, and the service and support. So I think for people listening, and they're thinking, well, I hear the word value pricing, how do I do it? What I often say to clients is start with your customer journey and their pain points. So work out what's causing them the most pain. What risks could they be exposed to? I think it's probably worthwhile bringing up that concept we talked about, value at risk. So quite often,
Mm.
people want to avoid risk and pain at all, as much as possible. There's a phrase in the startup world called sell painkillers, not vitamins. And that phrase relates to selling people benefits and wonderful futures and lives is not as attractive to customers as those that are being given relief from pains and headaches and risks and fears, uncertainties and doubts. So we are naturally wired as human species to mitigate risk. That's how we survive for 10,000 odd years. We look for risks, we look for downsides, we look for certainty before we then act. And it's often an unconscious thing. We just find ourselves behaving a certain way. And when you actually look at it back and join the dots, why did you do A, B, and C? You're taking steps to mitigate your risk at almost every turn. And for value prices, what's that significance of that mindset and behavior and that DNA of humans is, well, we need to get into their shoes and think about what causes them pain points, what causes them fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Write all that out, interview customers, and understand their journey, their stories, and really create some sort of real 3D understanding of that. And then once you've got that, you can then look at your product or service and the components of it and work out how well does what we do fit with that customer pain point journey. And once that's married and matched up, you can also start to look at obviously selling benefits and the accelerated progress you can make when you're using a certain service or product. But for value prices, the primary opportunity is to really understand pain points, and then that will inform how much effort you go into solving those pain points, and then obviously how much resources you allocate to those pain points. The real old adage is, no one, if you build something and no one wants it, it doesn't matter how cheap it is, it's still not going to be wanted. So you've really got to nail the offer that people really want. So that's the first point of call.
How wide and deep do you need to go in your view with, and I'm sure it varies by industry, but with that market research? How many people do you need to talk to? How many conversations is enough conversations?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Um, I think there's a sometimes I think when you talk to different people, depending on the product, how complex it is or how sophisticated it is, you could have a range of users, and in which case, if you had say 5 different versions of something, or that you identified 5 different markets, you might need to talk to say 10 or 20 people in each of those segments just to make sure you're cross-referencing and validating and get some statistical validity. If you wanted to take bare statistics, usually 30 people per segment is the right number. Statistically, that will give you the right number. So, but often by the time you've talked to the 10th person, you've got a pretty good picture of what's going to happen. But to
Yeah.
really nail the statistical validity, the minimum is 30. I would hazard a guess. So if you've got, say, 3 or 5 different price points or tiers, you might end up talking to 150 people, which will be a small investment. I wouldn't say it's a lot. And for people who are in the box seat of making the decision, I wouldn't outsource that to necessarily to a research company per se in its initial outset. There's some things in business that don't scale, and they shouldn't ever scale. And one of them is having a deep understanding of your customer's problem. I've worked with a number of founders of startups and worked with a lot of successful startup founders, and one of the things that is common to all of them is they have deep knowledge of their customers' pain.
Yeah.
And often the reason why they started the business was because they personally experienced a pain, and they determined that they would never experience that pain point again. So you find that understanding of the pain point is a really valuable way to determine your next step. So once you've got your basic research, then you could scale it out with research companies. But I would do the first initial research myself, if you like, or
Well, I think you're touching on a really important point there, which is it's not a one-off thing. You don't do it once and move on, because expectations are going to change, market conditions are going to change, people's perceptions of what their risk is. They're going. It's a constant. Maybe the first one's a huge benchmarking effort, but it keeps happening from there to measure against that benchmark.
yeah, no, 100%. There's I think in talks with clients about various things, we do mystery shopping sometimes maybe in a retail environment, and it's really amazing to see the feedback from people about, I used your service or I used your product, and this is how I feel about it. And that's often something that is hard when you're the seller of the product. You often get a cognitive bias about it's a great product. And the other thing that's interesting is for us who are in a job, and we've been in that job for more than say 12 months, there's a kind of I've noticed this working with thousands of people now, there's almost a snow blindness that you get because you wake up every morning thinking about your product or service. you end up with a cognitive bias that you think everyone knows about your product or service. They say things to be like, oh, well, everyone knows X, Y, and Z is better than that product.
Yeah.
And you have to say, well, actually, no, they don't.
Do they though? Yeah.
Yeah, they don't. And they've got to get the kids to school. They've got to pay their bills. They've got to do their job. And their um, cognitive credit, if you like, or their capacity to actually think through all the complexities of the service or product offer is extremely limited. So this is where, that education piece and being able to pitch a value set to a customer is so critical.
Yeah, your knowledge about your own product has to be data driven. It has to be driven from research, from analytics, etc. Um, just a couple of things to point on there, just to break down an example. When it came to going through your process with our B2B arm, I had to really break down into our channel, wholesale, and retail segments, then break down by size of business. Then each business had to break down by who we're talking to. We're talking to the owner or MD, we're talking to the salesperson, the finance manager, whoever it might be, the technical lead, because they all have different ideas of risks. They have different ideas of value. They have different things that make them look good or bad in their position and that make their job easier or harder. So you can't really, you can't go in with it. I'll talk to a person in a company and that's okay. You have to understand your segments and your people. So that was a big learning again for me, which makes it a bigger job, but it's super important. The other thing is I was very late to the party personally. You've known about this for years, but talking about the research element, it's now baked into just our DNA as a business. We've got a flywheel that is central to everything we do. We know that within that flywheel, if we focus on those key elements, make them work better, faster, lower cost, they're going to keep just turning it faster and faster. And at the very top of that flywheel now is understand our clients. And we've got an in-house research specialist. We've outsourced, as you say, a little bit to work in conjunction with her, but we've now benchmarked B2C, B2B. We have 6-month cadence on all the I guess understanding passive and lead recall, etc. And the need to understand our clients and keep understanding our clients to challenge every assumption we have internally is critical. And before I shut up, I'll just say one more thing, which is an example of the learning we've got from that. In our B2C space, we felt, we have a set coverage area within the mid North Island of New Zealand for our B2C offering. It's very distinct against our B2B offering, which is across New Zealand and Australia. But in that B2C offering in the mid North Island of New Zealand, we felt that everyone knew who we were. We have been around for 15 years. We've got this very distinct offer where we're now in the top 10 ISPs in New Zealand, et cetera, et cetera. We now know that's not the case. Researching people who have no fiber, no VDSL should be absolutely our perfect type of client. Our passive recall was horrible. When we asked them, okay, of these names of ISPs, who do you know? Not what we thought. So we now know that we need to focus on the top of the funnel. We need to work on that demand gen, So you can always learn and you should always challenge those assumptions.
No, that's spot on. And probably a corollary to that, or a flip side, is for businesses that have scaled and grown out. One of the things I noticed is that when I talk with a lot of sales teams, um, often they'll say to me, oh, what we're selling is a commodity, or we've become commoditized. And I think once you tell yourself you're a commodity, if you're doing that before anyone else does that for you, then I think you're really going to struggle to believe that you're creating value. And it's really about moving away from describing what you do in terms of physical properties and sort of, I call it the molecules of what you do, and understanding what you do in terms of the outcomes it creates for your customers. So to your point about understanding customers and the customer intimacy piece and resourcing of that, yeah, it takes a bit of effort and a bit of time, but it pays back in spades because you no longer look at what you're doing in terms of physical mechanics. You look at what you do in terms of outputs and value to customer, where a lot of salespeople end up feeling pressured to offer discounts or to offer specials, or obsessed with, we've got to offer a deal to close this customer, when the customer's not looking for deals as such, they're looking for outcomes to problems. I always like to make the example. I said nobody goes and gets brain surgery because the brain surgeon says there's 30% off this month, on exploratory brain surgery. You want the best brain surgeon that's going to do the right job to solve the problem. So sometimes that's another flip side to it, is this value research can help you move away from feeling like you're just selling a commodity.
Yeah. There's something I've seen quite a lot in the MSP space as well, where a founder started off by doing a lot of relationship based selling. You know, the person trusted them, they knew that they were capable, they knew that they would do what they said they would do within the time frame they said they'd do it within. As they scale, they cling on to that as the basis for selling, but it doesn't scale. How much have you seen that yourself, and have you got any advice for people in that situation who then have to, set price points that work for them going forward, allow them to scale, but don't have them at the center of the value put forward?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. There's an interesting thing here where businesses that are built based on the personal charisma or the personal skill set of an individual, um, yeah, typically they don't scale. But what has to happen is you actually have to have a three-tiered brand strategy for that, because if that person's charisma or magnetism does convert sales, you go, it would be crazy to walk away from that and just try and turn it into a mechanical sales process. So you actually have to there's three brands. You've actually got to create a personal brand, a a company brand, and then a product brand. And probably examples of that it's probably the most famous one is the Virgin brand, where you've got Richard Branson sitting at the top. You've got him below that. You've got the Virgin Company. Then below that, you've got, say, Virgin Atlantic, or any number of 100 odd Virgin businesses. But the reality is, every customer that flies with Virgin would say to you, I kind of know who Richard Branson is. I've read his book, or I've seen him on television, or I have some form of relationship. So that's how some companies get around this problem of the founder as charismatic salesperson leader, is that they actually feel like, once I use the word cult, but they present that person as front and center as part of the brand, and you build a relationship with that in the mind's eye of the customer, that this person is and that person's face becomes a trust mark, that and their values are imbued across everyone else's behaviors. Um, the other, so that's one way. If you don't have the luxury of that, you've just got someone who maybe they don't want to market themselves, or it's not appropriate. The business has changed hands, that sort of thing. Um, you've really got to come up with a brand positioning. You're going back to marketing fundamentals now, where you've got a clear brand positioning. And actually, you raise an interesting point. A lot of marketing and advertising, I feel, is wasted. We heard that phrase before, 50% of my advertising and marketing is waste. I just don't know which half. It's probably more like 80 to 90%. Because what I see with most advertising and marketing is that they're hung up on, they call it they say things like, oh, we're in the attention economy now. It's all about getting attention. And so that then defines the strategy of how we'll go to market. And getting attention might be using novelty, or it might be using some sort of exclamation, or it might be using some crazy discount. There's some sort of thing, but often it fails to address the value and the pain points. So we come back to this value pain point solution suite. And once you nail that, you can actually then create marketing that reflects that really easily. So um, if you can either get inside the head of the customer and help them have the conversation they're already having with themselves. So I need to solve product X, and then along comes some communication that helps me solve that. You're in a very good place. You'll build a lot of trust very quickly. The other one is helping educate customers on pains and risks that they didn't even realize that they had. And this is where value pricing and value selling, I get excited about helping people solve problems that they didn't even realize they had, but they're there. And they're effectively like ticking time bombs. And so many people have things go wrong in their lives, or they have a problem. And when you look back at how that thing went wrong, it's because they didn't understand what they had to do in the first place. I think that's where it's exciting for value prices and businesses. If you can help customers understand what they need to do in the first place, you can almost originate a customer. They weren't looking for the service or the product, but now that they've been educated on it, they'll buy it. And
Yeah,
that's exciting. And that's where you have pricing power, and that's where you have trust, and all of the, you talk about the flywheel. You have that flywheel of trust, value, and profits all working hand in hand.
absolutely. And I think, marketing hat on here, which I try not to put on too often because I'm out of my depth. But we're talking about demand gen, right? Click to learn more, not lead gen, which is click to buy. And if you can take, if you are going to go for that attention strategy, if you're going to grab someone's attention, you've got to use that moment to educate them or help them with something. Not necessarily sell to them. That can come later once they understand the problem they're trying to solve and how you can be the guide through that process. But you've got to deliver something, and that often is the hard part for businesses. Is what can I how can I educate this customer? How can I guide them through this problem they have to consider us as a potential solution for that? And then once you've kind of done that, then sure, then you go through the lead generation and close stage.
Certainly, and it's interesting. We're sort of seeing a convergence too of revenue generation strategies where you once, in the 60s and 70s, you had the advertising agency sitting aloof, if you like, from the customer or the client, coming up with big campaigns, and then that's moved away to more integrated models, and then but you still had sales and marketing and finance kind of separate divisions from each other in a business. Um, Now what you're seeing is, you know, the reduction in physical sales forces, where, to your point earlier about, if the founders moving on, or even physical sales forces are reducing and customers are making decisions online. They're using internet search to educate themselves, and quite often by the time they're looking to buy, they've already got 80% of their decision making already predetermined. And um, that really means, for businesses looking to move to a value pricing approach, you need to use the technology, the internet, and you need the platforms, the YouTubes, etc., to market to customers with, not with shout out advertising or interruption advertising, but really with problem solving content that they actually find for themselves, the customers actually find, or prospects find for themselves. And once they find that, that problem solving experience will either be fantastic or it will be maybe not as relevant. But if it's fantastic, you've effectively preloaded that customer to understand what they can get if they work with you. So, there's a concept now called the ascending transaction model, where you have like a thing called like a gift suspect, a product for prospect, your core offer, then a logical next step. So you'll actually have some sort of content that helps people learn how to become aware of the problem, or if they're already aware, how to solve that problem. And then once they've done that, they can make their first steps towards maybe solving that problem permanently or on a grander scale. And then once they've done that, they can then maybe embed that problem solving solution in their business on a much wider basis, or on a much grander scale, to help accelerate their progress in whatever they're doing. So, to your point before about, segmentation, top of funnel, middle of funnel, bottom of funnel, and then across the sort of top axis having the different personas, whether it's a CEO or a CFO or a marketing or sales manager, or whoever it might be. Um, there's definitely a need to identify who you're going to speak to and at what point in the buying journey are you going to talk to them.
Yeah, absolutely, and that feeds on nicely to the next part, I guess, in your framework, which is okay. You've spoken to your customers, you understand their pain points, you understand how they rate you against each of those, I guess, value at risk, value on offer type items. You then need to understand what your competition is doing, and again, maybe multiple competitors, ideally, and then understanding their price points, your price points, how each of those competitors and your own business are seen as able to address those. You come up through some magic numbers you've got. If anyone really wants to understand this completely, they can pay you for your time. But at a higher level, they've got a number, right? They're going to understand their business has a value premium of plus 10% or minus 10% against competitor A, B, C. And at that point, that's where you can kind of go, right, well, if I'm offering less value than the competition, in its current form, my business is not able to hand on heart put forward a price above that competitor for the same service or product, because the market does not perceive us to be able to justify that price point. So then you got two options, right? You can either go, right, well, I'm going to change that. I'm going to fundamentally change how we position ourselves or the segment we look to sell at, or you can sell at that price point, understanding the part of the market that you fill. Um, do you find that when you're working with customers, sometimes that's a hard pill for them to swallow, to realize they're not who they thought they were against the competition, or that the competition is better placed to offer that premium?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, every company believes they have a great service or product. Sometimes they say, no, we don't, our product is inferior. But there is a cognitive bias. Everyone believes that their product or service is the best in the market, and their marketing literature says it's the best. You pick up any marketing collateral for pretty much any company, and they'll use the words like "we're the finest" or "we pride ourselves in X, Y, or Z," and everything actually triggers what we call, or that's a phrase I call, that's marketing speak. So that we're actually in a post-marketing world now, where the minute we see marketing phrases like "we're the best," "we have the highest quality," I think all of us have this automatic trigger to go, well, that's marketing.
Just
Uh,
just switch off. Yeah.
yeah, it's a switch off. It's noise. It becomes white noise. Um, so, so yeah, it's a tricky situation right now with companies trying to sort of break through and I guess communicate that value to customers at the moment. Um,
Do you have any tips there for that messaging? If they're trying to pitch themselves as whether it's a greater value premium or a lesser value premium, some people don't want to be the most expensive in the market. How does that affect messaging?
I think it comes back to avoiding being all things to all people. That strategy doesn't work. So if you come up with the problem where you go, we do the audit of our value and we realize that we're actually inferior to a number of competitors or one or two. Um, the biggest thing I find is that you'll have an incumbent in a market that's been there for a long time, often a very traditional incumbent. And the reality is that a lot of new entrants have come in and they're offering faster, smarter, and even cheaper services. So they've got this inferior product or service at a higher price. And really what they're surviving on is their brand loyalty or the trust that people have in that brand. But over time, you can see what's going to happen is that people will eventually realize that it's not the best value. The market's not very efficient in this sense. People will stick with brands. In some cases, like banks, for example, people don't change banks. They just stay with the bank. There's very little churn. Once that's why the Commonwealth Bank in Australia gives away savings accounts to kids and puts $20 in the bank account because a bit like what PayPal did with when they first got started, they actually paid people to use the service. Um, they know that the churn rate is so low that if you can just get people into the system, they'll just stay regardless of the quality of the service they get. So you've got situations where businesses can get away with offering a lower quality. I mean, I'll give you a high profile example, say McDonald's. Um, they don't have the best quality burger. Um, I know that might be a shock for many listeners out there. So you heard it here
Yeah,
first.
broaden your horizons if that is a shock. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you've got to get down and check it out. But um, you go, well, okay, they don't offer the best quality, but what do they do? Well, they've got amazing service. You can't fault McDonald's service. Um, they're clean. You can't fault their cleanliness. So usually, sometimes they're not, but usually they're pretty darn clean. Um, and the thing that's not necessarily talked about, but I found this when I heard people who travelled overseas. They went to foreign countries. I said, "Where did you eat?" And they said, we went to the local McDonald's." I thought just to get right amongst the local cuisine and really
Yeah,
experience
yeah.
the culture.
Really, yeah, exactly. Really take it in. Yeah.
Yeah. But what those people were looking for, I mean, there's a certain portion of the population that don't want novel new experiences and excitement in their life. They kind of want predictability. They want certainty. And the reality is about 80% of people in the world want certainty and predictability over novel, unpredictable experiences. So it's the thrill seeker, novel person versus the one that wants what they always have. And there's an 80-20 rule there. So um, a lot of what, say, McDonald's offers in terms of value is predictability. So it's not so much you're after the best burger. It's not so much even that the service is the fastest either, because sometimes it's not. You can wait in a McDonald's now with their new model because it's cook on demand, not have the burger sitting there for 10 minutes waiting. But there is a predictability to it. Um, and that's valuable. So with the framework we talk about, it's really figuring out what elements of value customers are actually wanting to pay for or willing to pay for. So sometimes it's the physical properties of it that it actually has performance value. Um, Sometimes it's the value at risk where we avoid certain things happening. So we've got redundancies built into our capability or extra capacity or fixed uptime support, those sorts of things. Uh, and other times it's just an overall sense of certainty that I'm going to get A, B, and C with my experience and I'm familiar with it. So I'm going to pay for that. And, endless examples of those pop to mind, where people will go to the same family doctor they've always gone to, even though there might be a more highly qualified, more experienced doctor who might even provide a better service down the road, but people stay with their local family GP, if that makes sense. So,
Yeah,
yeah,
people also don't like confrontation, right? And in those sort of scenarios where there's a relationship of sorts, it's hard to say we've chosen another option. Sorry.
oh, yeah, you're exactly right. Particularly, then that's that personal relationships, and that's where the history of selling over the last 100 years has been built on getting under people's skin and building personal relationships because of that exact reason you pointed out, that people want to harmonize and feel connected, and also they want to avoid conflict. So if there's a path of least resistance, they'll stay with it. And for us trying to set prices, sometimes those things do matter. Um, but I think ultimately, your long-term best, most sustainable long-term strategy is to source out the value equation and be custodians of value for your customers. So being true and loyal to the concept of value, I think, is ultimately will serve everyone better. And you sort of take it from a profit perspective and from a environment perspective and from a customer stakeholder perspective. Um, you'll get a better outcome on balance than if you were just to simply look at other methods, which we started in the call, whether it's cost plus or just matching competition regardless of what they're doing. So that's
Absolutely.
probably it.
One last question, one last point and an associated question before I let you go. So in the professional services or managed services space at the moment, particularly managed services for MSPs, they've got a situation where you mentioned commoditization or commoditized products earlier on. To a certain extent, that's true with things like Microsoft licenses.
Yeah.
There's ease of transition, particularly like the ability for customers to churn without too much interruption when the ecosystem remains the same, the upstream provider is the same, just the person providing the license has changed. So there's some threats there, but at the same time, there's a fairly complex cybersecurity and privacy compliance space there that needs well-educated people who can guide businesses through that. So there's opportunities to add value, but there's also less stickiness in the key parts of these businesses. Given that real sort of, I guess, it's a complex space that they're in. Is there a particular path to pricing success in that particular space that stands out to other industries for you?
Yeah, look, I think where you've got heavily commoditized services and they're in the mature stage of their product life cycle and there's a lot of entrants with it. Um, I think the first thing is you've got to look at your business model and say, what's our business model? How are we going to sustain this? And then if you've got other services, like you mentioned before, you've got cybersecurity protections and other valuable intellectual property that can solve problems for customers. It's really about potentially bundling some of those things together so that people can access that IP solution and they get their commodity item as well. But it all makes sense valuably. So people don't feel like, well, I'm just going to buy the cheapest thing because that's all I think I need, and they don't buy something else. So you want to create value signals in your offers as well as your price architecture that people go, well, why are you selling those two as a bundle, or why are you selling those three as a bundle, for example? Um, we talked in part of on this call as well about unbundling and giving people core offers. That works in certain circumstances where you've got certainty that there's a follow-on sale if you get the first sale, for example. So, but ultimately, you've got to look at your business model. And where a lot of clients have gone, I've seen a lot of businesses go where they've got something that's commoditized. Its product life cycle is now very, very mature. Um, They absolutely have to, but what they have got that's amazing is a customer franchise and trust. So really it's about saying, well, we've got customer franchise and trust. We're in the business of providing certainty. What else can we offer to customers to give them certainty? So if you like, business has got to define what it does in terms of its value, not what it physically does. So to give you an example, a lot of in the 1900s, a lot of railroad companies went out of business because they defined themselves as a railroad company, not as a parcel transport or people transport company. They would have got into airlines instead of seeing the airlines as a threat, if you like. So one of the other elements to the question is it's a bit more strategic and a bit more involved, not specifically pricing, but it's really defining what business model we're in but going back to our value, what value do we create? And then the business that we're actually in is kind of a reverse engineer because we're in the business of creating outcomes in a certain space. Well, what tools or products or services do we then want to introduce to solve that problem for the customer? So that's often what I find working with clients is it's a pivot point for them. If they're in a place where they'll often say to me, look, we've got no more cards to play in the deck. We haven't got any face cards. We've got no aces in our hand. What do we do? And the answer is you've got to really redefine what game that you're actually playing, because a two of clubs is still a two of clubs. If you haven't got that either that incredibly low cost position to compete in a commodity space, or that's not going to work as a business model in a sustainable way. So to sum that up, it's really about looking at business model, the customer segments that you serve to make sure that you're playing in the right market space, and then doing things like the bundling or the value signaling to then try and bring that all to a head.
Nice. Nicely summarized there at the end. All right, Ron, I think I've held you up for long enough. We should wrap up the chat there, but I've really enjoyed it. Lots of really good insights as always from you. So thank you very much. And at the moment, pricing insights, I assume if people are trying to figure out how to navigate this period of high inflation, you're open to people making contact through LinkedIn?
Yeah, through LinkedIn, they can make contact or jump on the pricinginsight.com.au website as another way to have a conversation.
Great. Good on you. All right. Thanks, Ron. We'll leave it there.
All right. Cheers, Brendan.
Cheers. All right. That's us for this week. Be joined again, as always, by Nick Phillips next week to go through some news and opinions. If you want to hit me up with any ideas for future episodes or just to get in touch and follow along with what we're doing at Lightwire or on the podcast, hit me up on LinkedIn. Brendan.Ritchie at insightsasaservice.fm is also the email address you can reach me at. Thanks for listening. See you soon.